Danse, Anine, bonjour, hello, welcome to APTN InFocus. I'm Dennis Ward. Today we're going to be taking a look back at the wildfire season and some of the causes of extreme weather events and what can be done to make a positive impact towards climate change. Before I introduce you to our guests, APTN News reporter Sav Jonesa sums up the summer wildfires raged.
Record-setting wildfires affected several areas of Canada this past summer. More land was burned throughout the country this year than ever before in recorded history. Almost 185,000 square kilometers of land has been scorched since the 1st of January, more than double the next highest year for land burned in 1995. Flames, smoke, and the uncertainty of what would be left impacted tens of thousands of evacuees as they fled their homes.
Traumatizing when you're given 3 hours to pack a bag and you walk around your house and say, what am I going to take?
Alice Rigney is an evacuee from Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation in northern Alberta. Fires raged on throughout the northern and central parts of the province. Despite this, Alberta was still the destination for many evacuees from the Northwest Territories. 68% of Northwest Territories' population were evacuated. Their capital city of Yellowknife was only 15 kilometers away from a wildfire.
The human toll of this wildfire season is pretty difficult to overestimate. We've had big fire seasons like this where we've had millions of hectares of land burned before. 2014 was quite notable in that over 3 million hectares of land had burned. However, this year, so many of our fires have either started very close to communities or eventually encroached upon communities due to the extreme conditions we're seeing out there.
Telecommunications like phones and internet were disrupted, leaving many without a way to know what was happening in their home communities. In British Columbia, there were more than 2,000 wildfires this year alone. Lightning and an unusual lack of rain was the cause for the vast majority of cases.
I described it as a hurricane. Trees pushed over by their roots.
There are still more than 300 active wildfires burning across British Columbia today. In eastern Canada, Montreal had the worst air quality in the world in June thanks to the fires in Quebec. Nova Scotia had the largest wildfires in their recorded history. More than 100 suburban homes were lost in Halifax. Across the board, climate change has been regarded by scientists as the main factor for the increase in wildfire destruction.
James Jenkins is the Executive Director of Indigenous Clean Energy, also known as ICE. ICE supports First Nations, Inuit and Métis participation in clean energy projects from across Canada. Daryl spoke to James earlier.
James, thank you so much for being here today. My first question for you is going to be pretty basic, but can you describe for our audience a bit of your work at Indigenous Clean Energy?
Yes, thank you for having me, Daryl. It's great to be here. What we do at Indigenous Clean Energy is we primarily deliver educational programs to support Indigenous communities and businesses in participation in the clean energy transition. So we have a number of youth programs now, but really we're throughout the space and across Canada in terms of supporting Indigenous organizations in being part of the clean energy and projects in transition.
So then what does the programming sort of look like? Can you sort of walk us through, maybe how you guys will go about going to a community?
Sure. So we began with what we call the 2020 Catalyst program, and we really tried to recruit leaders in the field that were ready to either start very large projects or get to the next level. So we had a cohort with a 3-week intensive starting about 8 years ago, and that's continued as our flagship program. So we've grown to include about 1,000 individuals who are either past participants, mentors, and are part of our network in various ways. So it's really all about supporting individuals in the field, making sure they have that support network and resources to really succeed.
So you mentioned this is still obviously relatively new then, if it only started about 8 years ago, you said, right? So I guess going back to the start of all this, why was this started as well? Why was this something that people saw was a need?
Well, I think over the last 20 years, we've seen more opportunities across Canada for Indigenous communities and businesses to become involved in clean energy and to lead projects. And that's continued to expand. So today, collectively, Indigenous organizations represent the third largest owner of clean energy assets after governments and utilities, and that's only continued to expand. So we filled a gap in terms of making sure there are those resources for those leading in the field, leading their communities, starting businesses, and beginning these clean energy projects. And as the opportunities continue to expand with electrification, we're seeing more and more demand for this kind of programming.
So then, James, when you look at the current state of climate and the impacts of extreme weather events, I mean, is there something that you're seeing that's maybe causing, more of these than another, thing? Like, I'm just overall, when you're looking at climate change and sort of how you're seeing that develop, is there anything that Indigenous clean energy is seeing that might be a catalyst for these?
In terms of greater impacts from climate change?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at, yeah.
Okay, well, certainly I think we've all experienced the impacts of greater occurrence of wildfires over this last year, which is related to drier conditions, larger, higher overall temperatures. And I think we're seeing positive feedback loops all across the country. So where I am in the Great Lakes region, we're seeing very little ice cover on the Great Lakes, which means that the role of the Great Lakes in moderating the temperature doesn't function as it normally did, and we're seeing warmer temperatures in the summer. And that's happening in other regions, whether that's impacts on the snow caps or permafrost. So we're seeing larger, and we're seeing conditions that are leading to more wildfires. And we're seeing the impact of unsustainable forest management practices over many years. So it has created the conditions for much of the forest in Canada to be susceptible to wildfires. So it's really a perfect storm that we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. So then, James, can you sort of walk us through some of the current projects that you might be working on? Are you able to give us a bit of insight into what you guys are doing?
Sure. So we've supported individuals that are leading some very exciting projects. And I think where we see some synergies between wildfires, mitigating the damage of wildfires, are some of the potential in biofuels and biomass. So that's really using some of the residue that comes from standard forestry practices, or reducing some of the smaller vegetation that you see on the forest floor, and then using those materials for heat or to be able to feed electricity into the grid. So a couple major projects, there's White Sand First Nation here in Ontario, and they've been successful with a large biomass plant. There's Meadow Lake in Saskatchewan, and then there are dozens of smaller projects and communities, really coast to coast, but they've succeeded primarily through federal support. So we do think it's part of the puzzle in terms of having a larger solution for some of the forestry issues contributing to wildfires. But we're excited to see some of these larger clean energy projects that are using biomass to create energy that are successful. They're Indigenous-led in a few key areas across the country.
Well, you just mentioned Indigenous-led. How significant is it that it is Indigenous people, Indigenous communities at the forefront of these projects of wanting to sort of do better?
It's very important for a number of reasons. I think one reason is it does represent an economic opportunity for many communities, where we've seen a long history in Canada of various electrical projects, hydroelectric projects, where often the story has been one of dispossession and loss. Today, as we look at electrification in the future, we're going to be seeing the renewal of hydroelectric projects, and likely in most places, an expansion of wind, solar, and some of these other technologies like biomass. So it represents an opportunity for Indigenous communities, nations, businesses to participate in a more fair and equitable way. And there are some examples where utilities have created the right conditions for that kind of partnership to take place. So part of it is really just having a just transition where, as we look at the infrastructure that's going to be required over the next couple of decades to meet net zero targets, there is this partnership happening, and Indigenous peoples are part of the equation. But there are other advantages as well. We see Indigenous communities having greater knowledge of the landscape that has certain advantages. Certainly when we're talking about forest fires, forestry management, there's cultural knowledge that really hasn't been harnessed or utilized in any way in past forest practices. So we know in many of these places there were traditional burning practices. That's certainly the case in my neck of the woods in southern Ontario and really across Canada. So we've seen success over the last 20, 30 years where Indigenous partners have led projects. Normally the result is we have communities that are thinking several generations ahead. So the business mindset can be more sustainable. We make good business partners as Indigenous peoples. But in addition to that, some of the potential challenges when Indigenous peoples are on the other side of the fence, potentially questioning projects and creating roadblocks, that I think could be a real hindrance when we look at the kind of growth that's going to be needed to meet net zero targets. So from a partnership perspective, it makes sense, and clean energy in many cases is in alignment with our values as stewards of the land. So it's a very good fit as an economic development opportunity, as in a way to be part of climate solutions.
Mm-hmm. Well, you made a lot of really good points there, James, and when we sort of take an overall look at sort of what we've talked about so far, what are some of the things that maybe need to be done on a sort of basic level in order for change to happen in the future here, in terms of, it could be, something a community member can do, or if somebody wants to make a difference, like what are just some basic things that need to be changed here as we go forward?
Well, one reality is that the clean energy field is going to continue to expand. So for community members wanting to know what they can do, it's a viable career field where a person can make a difference getting involved in clean energy. And I encourage folks to visit our website, where we do offer a number of programs from youth to people that have some experience in business or other fields and would like to get into clean energy. So there is that opportunity, and through our youth programs, we support some smaller scale projects that have big impacts. Like, for example, community greenhouses that have connections to schools that are supported by solar, and some very innovative projects that bring pride to communities, bring pride to youth that are involved in them. So I think it is important to start small so that there is that community awareness. There are real opportunities here, and there is the possibility of being part of change for the good.
Mm-hmm. And just, so we're talking about clean energy. Can you just maybe go through some of what clean energy sort of is, and some of the clean energy that you're talking about? No, it seems pretty basic, but what is clean energy to you and to Indigenous clean energy?
So generally what clean energy is to us is we ask the questions, is it green? So is the energy contributing to climate action? Is it not creating more problems in terms of releasing carbon? So is it clean? Is it sustainable? And we're part of the conversation in terms of what utilities can do, what governments can do, so that there is the right kind of demand for clean technologies. We talked a bit about biofuels. That's a good example, where some of the successful projects have relied on subsidies. There is the opportunity to, through procurement and through other means, to make those technologies more viable, because they are part of the climate solution. So we look at, is it green? Is it sustainable? And finally, is it just? And that's where we look at a just transition. Are Indigenous partners being treated fairly as partners on some of these larger projects? So for us, it's generally a 3-part test. Certainly because of access to technology and opportunities, most of our program participants have focused on solar and wind, but we're potentially seeing other shifts as electrification ramps up, as the federal government has made a firmer commitment in the past 6 months or so. And so we may see other technologies like biomass and a number of other technologies possibly taking more center stage. But we'll continue to ask that test as we look at various possibilities in the field.
And if a community or you know, or an organization wants to, they have an idea and they want to know how to partner with you, how do they go about sort of doing that and going through the proper process? Can you walk us through how these partnerships come to be?
So generally for us, it's an application process, and we are in almost every case looking for an Indigenous lead. And so they can contact us directly, and our program leads will walk them through the process and support them. Sometimes we're approached by non-Indigenous partners, and in those cases, we work with them and really encourage them to identify that Indigenous lead. And we see that as being a really critical piece when it comes to these projects being successful, ensuring that there is that capacity within the Indigenous community or business that's either leading the project or that's a partner. And so we do focus on making sure that the kind of supports to make that person or those individuals or that team successful on the Indigenous side have what they need.
Well, James, that's plenty of great information and a lot of great points made by you there. We'll have to leave our conversation there for now, but I want to say thank you, Miigwech, to you for coming on and sharing a bit of what Indigenous clean energy is and how important Indigenous clean energy is as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Daryl. Thanks for having me. Thanks so much.
Time to step aside for just a quick moment. When we return, we'll hear from a couple of our own reporters about what they've seen this year.
Do you have a question or comment? Send your thoughts to infocus@aptn.ca. Share your voice with APTN InFocus on your favorite social media and watch live on APTN News, YouTube, and TikTok.
Welcome back to APTN in Focus. Trevor Wright is our video journalist based in Iqaluit. He'll be going on a trip even further north, looking at the impacts of climate change. Daryl spoke to him earlier about the trip and what he's seen when it comes to extreme weather events.
Trevor, it's a pleasure to be able to speak with you today. Now, this episode of In Focus is all about climate change and forest fires and all these extreme weather events. So we'll start pretty simple with your area here. What's the last few months been like sort of in your area that you're in?
Hey, Daryl. In the area I've been, it's been kind of, so I'm based in southern Nunavut, so it's been kind of rainy, but I'm originally from Yellowknife, and I guess this summer, has been really intense with regards to forest fires, like particularly in northern communities in NWT and Yukon. Obviously, I guess one of the biggest forest fire related stories this year has been the Yellowknife evacuation. Like, as I mentioned before, I'm originally from there, and I never had to evacuate there, like growing up there. Like, that was kind of like unprecedented.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, Trevor, and just as we go back a little bit, like you said, what have the last few years been like? You said you know nobody's ever really had to evacuate Yellowknife before. So are people seeing more extreme weather events? Are you seeing more extreme weather events? Sort of as we go back and look, over the last few years here, sort of what's been the situation?
Yes, extreme weather events are not new to the region. I touched upon Yellowknife before, but Hay River has been dealing with things like this for years now. Like 2022, last year, like it was extreme flooding, but this year there was forest fires. Like a very similar story with Old Crow in Yukon. They dealt with flooding, and this year they also dealt with forest fires. So it's not new, I guess, seeing these in the last few years. Like Yellowknife has certainly been a big example, but communities have been dealing with this for years now. So.
Right, and then so what are the people you speak with? What are they saying about these events, about the weather? Like, what are the people on the ground here saying about everything that's going on?
Yeah, well, the people are. They're reacting to the evacuations. Like, as I mentioned before, Yellowknife never had to evacuate, and I guess it's just causing a lot of anxiety, I suppose, dealing with all these different extreme weather events. Like, it doesn't have to go as far as an evacuation. It could be just like the foundation of your house changing, or the changing weather from, say, when you were younger. Like, the reactions to climate change can take like many different forms, I suppose. So.
And just on a personal level, Trevor, being from Yellowknife, I mean, when you see these sort of things happen, what sort of goes through your mind? I mean, I imagine you got some family and friends still out there, and sort of on a personal level, how does this sort of affect you?
It's always on the back of my mind. Like, I don't live there anymore, but like a lot of my family still does. Like, during the forest fire evacuations, I've had cousins in Grand Prairie, Edmonton. I had an aunt who had to evacuate to Calgary. As very similar story with all my childhood friends and whatnot. They had to leave behind a lot of their belongings. Like, one of my friends on a Facebook talked about having to, I guess, leave their cat for a while, and it was just a lot going on, I guess, and it's disrupting people's lives. So.
Yeah, and it can certainly be a scary time as well. And just so sort of along the same lines as that, Trevor, what kinds of resources are available to some people that might be affected by these extreme weather events, or whether it be a forest fire or any sort of event? I know there's lots of talk about when they do have to evacuate, what is available to them. Can you sort of give our viewers a bit of insight into what some people can expect if they do have to leave, and the resources that they have at their disposal?
It's been kind of, it's been, I guess, happening on a per government basis. Like, going back to the NWT forest fires, like, they offered a one-time $750 payment, but a lot of these people had to evacuate. Like, some of them had to pay for their own hotels. Like, sometimes the hotels got paid for them, but with that combined with the increased cost of living, like, $750 is not enough for evacuations such as this. So I would say, like, resources are being offered, but in a lot of these cases, people need more resources, especially if they're poor. Like take Indigenous people, for example. Like, on average, we're poorer than the average Canadian, and that being said, we don't have as much money as the average Canadian has, for example. So.
Well, and I wanted to switch gears just a little bit. I know you do have an upcoming trip to the Arctic up north, Trevor. Can you give us just a little bit? I know the details aren't all finalized quite yet, but can you talk about that trip a little bit and what's going to be happening?
Yeah. Well, our upcoming trip, we're hoping to, I guess, go up to the high Arctic. Like, I'm personally based. I'm based here in Iqaluit, Nunavut, but we're hoping to go to the high Arctic and see the impacts of climate change, like what the impacts on climate change are having in Inuit communities. Like, we're hoping to go to the two communities, Resolute Bay and Grise Fjord, and up in northern Nunavut, that's home to the some of the last, I guess, multi-year sea ice in the Arctic, I suppose, and climate change is expected to have a very big, significant impact on, I guess, Arctic summer sea ice in the coming decades, and we're hoping to see, I guess, how that's affecting people.
And the two communities you mentioned, Trevor, those, just for our audience, those are very, very far north, right? Like, you said you're in Iqaluit, and this is like even farther north by quite a bit, right?
Yeah. Iqaluit's on a southern Baffin Island, so you go like it's like way north, like if you look on the map of Canada, like, there's Ellesmere Island, and then a little bit south of that, there's Grise Fjord, which is one of the, I guess, highest continuously inhabited communities in the country. There's alert, but that's more of a research weather type station. But Dries Fjord is, I guess, the highest continuously, one of the highest continuously inhabited communities in Canada. So.
For sure, yeah. And so, Trevor, we'll certainly keep an eye on that trip and all the great stuff that you're going to be grabbing from that. And we'll leave it there for now, Trevor. But again, thank you so much, miigwech to you for coming on and sharing a bit of some insight into what's going on here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Daryl.
Also going on the trip with Trevor is Danielle Parody. She's one of our fantastic web reporters who's based in Edmonton. Danielle has seen a lot of the human side of things when it comes to evacuees who were staying in Edmonton and what they had to say. Daryl spoke with Danielle earlier.
Danielle, thank you so much for joining us here. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. Now, this episode is all about climate change and forest fires and the like. So my first question for you, what's the last few months been like out in your area, out in Alberta?
I was looking back at all of the forest fire coverage that we've done, and since May, it's been an incredibly busy wildfire season. We've had northern Alberta evacuations. There's, of course, been the Yellowknife evacuation, where the entire city had to move either north or south. There's been the West Kelowna, McDougall Creek fires. In Alberta, there was Lac St. Anne. There was a temporary evacuation order. Rainbow Lake, Fox Creek, and, of course, Fort Chip, where APTN went up to report. So it's been a very busy season.
Well, and when we look at all these fires and sort of as we go further back a bit, what have the last few years been like? Like, are you seeing more extreme weather events? Are you covering more, types of these stories as we sort of look at this overall over the last few years?
This has certainly been the busiest, but I think we have seen increasing weather events in Alberta. In particular, there was Slave Lake fires, there was flooding in High River. There's been increased events over the last 5 years, and there's no sign that that's going to stop. It seems like things are just getting more extreme on the weather side.
Mm-hmm. And so where you are in Edmonton, it's often a place for evacuees to go, especially those who are from the north. You mentioned the Yellowknife fires, and a lot of people went to Edmonton when they did have to leave. What are the people you speak with saying when they are in Edmonton, these evacuees?
Yeah, when people are here, it's often a very frustrating time for them. So they're experiencing displacement. They're experiencing the stress of having to have packed up what they want to take with them and left, and not knowing what your house is, like whether your house is there. As you can imagine, Daryl, it's usually a very traumatic time. We also actually see things like overdoses during that time period with the fentanyl and the high level of toxicity in drugs. That's a link between the wildfires and opioid deaths that we're seeing. You also see people who have PTSD. So when we're talking to people, quite often there's been a reluctance to talk to media. They're just trying to get through their day. But for example, in Fort Chip, when we were up there, people had evacuated to Fort McMurray. When we saw people there, they were playing a bridge tournament. There was this really great group of elders that were just trying to keep their spirits up. So people have been resilient, but it's also a deeply stressful time.
So, and then I maybe should have asked this just before the previous question, but what sorts of resources are made available specifically for those who need to be evacuated, to northern Alberta? Like, what do they have at their disposal? You said it's sort of a frustrating time for some, and some are just making do with what they have.
Yeah, it changes depending on what province you're in. So, for example, when Yellowknife evacuated the Northwest Territories, there was a lot of confusion, but people were eventually given $750, a one-time payment. But some people were out of their home for several weeks. So as you can imagine, that doesn't stretch very far. In Alberta, the benefits were a little bit larger. We're looking at $1,250 and $500 for children or dependents. So as well as, depending on where you are and your nation, Fort Chip, for example, many of the Indigenous communities there help to cover some costs for their evacuees. So you see kind of different things. It's not exactly equally spread out.
Mm-hmm. And it just another sort of broad look at climate change and all these weather events. Danielle, you will be going on an Arctic trip way up north. Can you talk a little bit about the trip and what's going to be happening?
Yeah, absolutely. Daryl, I'm really excited about this. We're going to be in Iqaluit, as well as up in Resolute Bay and Grease Ford. And there we're going to be speaking with hunters. We're going to be speaking with people who live off the land. And really, the Arctic is a place where we're seeing the way of life change due to the changing climate and soil erosion. We're hoping to get up to a protected area where it's usually the last place where ice exists in the summer. And as early as 2050, there might not be summer ice that far north. So we're really facing extreme changes in weather, and I think it's a great time to look into that.
So just further to your point, that why is now that right time? Is it because this climate change and everything is just sort of impacting more and more, and we want to get up there now? Like, well, why is now the right time, Danielle?
Yeah, I mean, quite worrisome. If we don't get up there now, we may not be able to capture things that won't be there in the future, whether it's summer ice or, polar bear migration, the effects on animals. Even in Alberta, at Banff National Park, the glaciers have tremendously receded. So I think it's important to, for one, to capture those things, to get a chance to speak to the people, but also to continue to bring awareness in the way that I think news still does, through people's lived experiences. Like, what is it like to deal with this change? What changes are in your community? What kind of provisions are you hoping for? And is the government actually set up to deal with these emergencies?
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to go back quickly here to another question I asked you about. I mean, you speak with the evacuees and people who are, trying to get away from these natural disasters and forest fires and what have you. But when it comes to the Indigenous people and specifically when it's sort of around their land, have you been able to speak with them about how this sort of impacts their way of life at all?
I think that was most clearly seen in Fort Chip. So there'd been issues with tailings pond leaks in the area and concerns about the way of life. And then on top of that, you add wildfires. And Melody Lepine from Mikisew Cree First Nation talked to APTN and told us that there was real concerns that these dual pressures of resource extraction plus wildfires and changing climate did mean that people were often not able to live on fish, or concerned about hunting and gathering and what kind of chemicals would be in their food. Although there was testing from the oil companies, as you can imagine, the communities, they just don't always trust that they're getting all of the information. So when you add wildfires, you have people displaced during the prime season for hunting and for gathering food or to set up camp, and that also affects their food storage for the rest of the year.
Mm-hmm. Well, Danielle, we'll have to leave it there, but we certainly look forward to this upcoming trip that you'll be on along with, I believe, Trevor Wright, and we'll be watching that and, of course, watching all these stories that come to light here. So thank you so much for giving us a little detail into some of this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Daryl.
Be sure to stay tuned to APTN National News and aptnnews.ca for their series to the high Arctic in the coming weeks. We have to take one final break here on the program, but we will speak with two more people when we come back. Welcome back. First Nations have been implementing controlled fires to the land to reduce the risk of wildfires. It's called cultural burnings. The practice was criminalized as an assimilation tactic, but advocates say cultural burnings should be utilized once again. Joe Gilchrist and Leona Antoine are members of the Salish Firekeeper Society.
Joe, Leona, thank you both so much for taking a few minutes of your time today. Joe, I want to start with you and keep this first question for you basic. Who are firekeepers and what is the role of a firekeeper?
The Interior Salish Firekeepers, and I guess the firekeepers across Canada, are Indigenous fire practitioners that apply fire to the land as required to improve the berry picking, the other foraging that Indigenous people do, improving the food for the animals and the medicine that we pick ourselves. And we take our directions and go by old stories about the land from the elders and from the matriarchs of the land.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, we'll touch on that again just in a little bit. I do want to get to Leona quickly here. Leona, I know you have a couple of roles. We just talked off camera about what you do, and one of those roles is registered forest technologist, and as well as a few others. What do you focus on in your line of work, Leona?
Yes, there's a number of things that are cutting edge right now. And so it's the holistic planning for the landscape and ensuring that there's Indigenous lands. And so taking a look at what used to be, what some of the outcomes of some of those forest practices, and how we can mitigate and ensure that it's sustainable for our medicines.
So then with that, Leona, what are some of the things that you recommend that can help keep those things sustainable and maybe help also reduce impacts of forest fires and that sort of thing? What are you seeing that can help sort of sustain what you just talked about?
I would recommend a different way of doing. And so really having a First Nations sitting at the table and planning to see what the broader landscape should look like. And so I think there should be different species of trees planted, the density, and also just allowing nature to do what it needs to do and having natural successional planting.
Well, you mentioned the trees, so this is interesting to me. You mentioned a different species of tree. Why is that something that you think is important? And it might not be something that people think of, but why would that be important to sort of help with this?
So right now we have the interior that is dominant lodgepole pine, and lodgepole pine matures at 150 years old. And so we need to ensure that we have a fire resilient stand that can withstand the fires that we're experiencing now.
Okay, that's super interesting. And Joe, I'll come to you here. Can you explain, we touched just at the beginning about the fire keepers and the importance of fire keeping. Can you explain the importance of cultural burns as well to Indigenous people and the land, and maybe how they can reduce the impacts of forest fires as well if cultural burns are happening?
Yeah, so cultural burns happened all across Canada by Indigenous people of the land. And it was applied to the land for different reasons, like I was saying, whether it's berry picking or improving hunting, improving wetlands, improving the stabilization of the creeks and rivers. We used to drink out of our rivers and lakes, but we can't anymore. Along with fire, there's water and so bringing back cultural burning and beavers at the same time would definitely help to improve the land and bring it back to the practice that we as Indigenous people use the land for over thousands of years. And by burning regularly in the springtime and the fall time, you reduce the fuel. You choose the species of trees that you want and how far they're spread out and how much fuel is on the ground. And if you want grassland or meadows, you burn it every 2 years. If you want berry patch or deciduous stands, like for moose or huckleberries, you would burn it in the fall every 4 years. That keeps the conifer trees from taking over the huckleberry stands and berry stands, and because they need 50% shade to be healthy. And so this cultural burning practice that took over thousands of years, it makes the land more of a mosaic of different things. The fire management or the forest management right now calls for continuous trees and forest that go on and on and on. So that's the reason why we're seeing, and overstocked. But that's the reason why we're seeing such huge and large fires, because cultural burning was made illegal just over 100 years ago now. And all that work from our ancestors, over thousands of years, is coming to an end because of that one law of stopping cultural burning.
And Joe, as well, I read an article that you wrote, and you recently talked about a number of different things, and some of that is preventative burns, including expediting the approval process for these burns to happen. Why do you believe that, sort of loosening or expediting this approval process is important to, allowing this to make this process better?
Yeah, right now it's illegal to burn off the Indian Reserve, and on the Indian Reserve, some people still don't like cultural burning. There needs to be like a shift in the thinking of the general public and Indigenous people, and just trying to remember the stories of the past, of how the land was before contact and how fire was used. And I'm sorry, I forgot your question again. Say that again.
Oh, just talking about the expediting the approval process, and why that's so important, and why that needs to happen here in order to sort of help with this, the forest fires and the sort of the changes that result with that.
Yeah, and since it's been illegal now, and the direction that we're getting from the government is to go through prescribed burning, which is a long process, which could take 3 to 5 years to implement a fire. It has to go through signatures and has to go through all this red tape and everything. And the difference between prescribed burning and cultural burning is from you're from the land, and you know when a good day is to burn, and generally you burn in the springtime and the fall time. In and around your communities to make it safe, and that just knowing the land and knowing the weather where you're from, and just being able to go out on the land and burn it on a perfect day is a lot safer than trying to choose a day 3 to 5 years down the road and have all the right equipment and have the perfect indices. I mean, it could be too rainy, it could be too windy, a lot of different reasons to say, no, I can't do the burn today. But anyway, I guess that's the difference, is being on the land and just knowing when the best time is to burn.
And Leona, I'll come to you for this question, and just maybe, how important is it that that there is things like cultural burning, as well as what you talked about with some of the more traditional, or some of the more cutting edge things, that we're sort of using both of those, working together as a way and a means to reduce the impacts of forest fires? How important is it to have both of these things?
Well, the connection between the land and First Nations is critical, and it's about relationships with the winged ones, the finned ones, the four-legged and two-leggeds, ensuring that it's sustainable for them and also for us to have food security. And with climate change, there's a lot of, moving pieces with drought and maturing forests and a lack of forests. So how do we collaborate those relationships so we have the best outcome for our culture, for our food security, adapt to climate change? And so it's going to create a lot of relationships amongst all those that are doing decisions on the land base.
And Leona, where do you hope things go in the future? What do you hope happens here as we move forward, and as we try to, again, reduce the impacts of forest fires and just climate change as a whole? What do you hope happens as we move forward? What would you like to see happen?
I would like to see all of our beliefs and teachings reflected in policy, legislation, how things are managed on the land base. So we see ourselves as time goes by, we need to ensure that it's for the sustainability of all living creatures, and also for 7 generations.
And Joe, I'll ask you the same question. Like, what would you like to see happen as we move forward here, as you know, we go into the future?
Yeah, definitely a change in attitude about good fire and bad fire, and we need to see our children from kindergarten to grade 12 learning about cultural burning in the land. We need to educate our youth on how to use fire from kindergarten to grade 12, and we need a way to train our young men and ladies on actually implementing the use of fire on the land and how it was done, and creating an Indigenous-led organization that is able to apply land the way that it was done over thousands of years before contact.
And just before we let both of you go, Joe, you mentioned good fire and bad fire, and I think that's a great way of describing this. Just can you talk about the importance of, like, the burning of, with like a cultural burn, for example, the burning of certain areas, but it's for the good, that would be a good fire, right? As opposed to, some people might think that that's a bad fire. Can you describe again, like, the good fire and the bad fire? I think that's a great way of putting sort of how these fires are.
Sure. Yeah, so for thousands of years, the indigenous people of the land all over North America and generally, you know, all over the world, used fire in a good way, and like I'll say, you know, improve your land, improve the safety of your community, improve the foraging for the animals that we use for making sure the waters are stabilized. Good fire is generally in the springtime and fall time. But at different elevations. Also here in BC, we have high elevation areas that don't dry out until June, July, August, and we used to burn those for wild strawberries and grizzly bear habitat, and you know, all kinds of reasons why different areas was burned. And in the lower elevations, where 90% of the population lives in British Columbia, around the waterways, and people like to have their homes right by the river and creeks and stuff, and those areas along the water courses were burned, and the willow, alders, birch, and cottonwood, and the grassland, the grass right up to the trees, actually stabilized the riverbank, so they couldn't really move, and that was a healthy habitat for beavers too. So the beavers made sure that the water wasn't moving fast through there, and you had stabilization on the creeks and rivers by taking fire away. And then the fir and the ponderosa pine and the sage, they drop a chemical, and it actually takes those types of trees away that stabilize the bank. And now you're seeing in the springtime and the fall time, or even, you know, whenever you get a climate change weather event, heavy rain, with flooding, and then you see the water start to move. The trees of fir and ponderosa pine aren't made for stabilization, and they get washed away a lot easier, and so they start falling in, and then you start to see the creek and river moving. And that's, you know, just a simple thing from not allowing fire, not allowing the good fire.
Well, Joe, Leona, we'll have to leave it there, but this was such a wonderful conversation. I'm glad we were able to do this. And again, thank you both for taking a few minutes of your time to be able to share with us a bit of your knowledge, both of you. Thank you so much, Miigwech.
Okay, thanks.
And that's all the time we have for today's show. A reminder to stay tuned for APTN's Danielle Parody and Trevor Wright series on the high Arctic in the coming weeks. Today's episode will also be available as a podcast. You can listen and subscribe on aptnnews.ca/podcasts or find us on your favorite player. And if you've missed any of our past episodes and want to catch up, you can find them and more on aptnnews.ca/InFocus. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for being with us this week. Have a good rest of your afternoon.